For this week's discussion board, we were asked to view 2 documentary films and analyze the effectiveness of the storytelling therein. The first one I'd like to discuss is A World Without Water. This documentary had a more traditional documentary style with voiceover narrations, multiple subjects interviewed, and multiple examples from all over the world. So what did they do well? They utilized several persuasive strategies. Pathos, appeal to emotion, was probably most heavily used in this particular documentary. They featured families too poor to connect to water in Bolivia, farmers that may have to abandon land passed down for generations in India, and they clearly demonstrated the divide between the haves and the have-nots. Ethos is the appeal to ethics. They utilize this through loaded language like basic human rights and setting up the contrast between big business versus families or farmers. They also used a great deal of logos or a logical argument with startling statistics like the number of children dying each year for want of clean water, how many people had water cut off in one year in Detroit, a percentage of deaths related to bad water, etc. They also were able to create a sense of urgency. Sykes, Malik, and West explain there are several ways to do this, one of which is changing the social or political expectation by describing this as a global crisis, by pointing to the humanitarian aspects of this issue. I believe the documentary filmmakers were able to make that clear in this documentary. They also include the deadline concept. In this case, it was more of a doomsday situation, but they had several experts pointing to a specific time in the relatively near future where we would see a lack of clean water throughout the world, and that includes that deadline concept. They also intermingled types of persuasion throughout the piece, so the audience didn't become complacent with the type of method of persuasion they were using. They mixed the emotional personal stories with statistics and other logical persuasion. They were also to create an enemy or a villain in the idea of big business controlling the water. Sykes, Malik, and West also point to that as a particularly important narrative strategy. They were also able to demonstrate global impact of this issue. Potter explains that communication is most powerful when it becomes personal, and the filmmakers were able to do that very well. They made it personal and the feeling of being inescapable to the audience. McDougall stated, "Photographs and films, perhaps more than written descriptions, seem liable to distortion in this way because of the continuity they share with the physical and sensory life of their referents." McDougall explains that documentarians have a responsibility to let other cultures speak for themselves rather than the director or producer speaking for them. And this quote sort of points to that, in that the visual is so powerful that we need to be careful in showcasing that to let them speak for their own culture rather than applying our own bias to what we're showing through film or images. A World Without Water does this effectively by contradicting information from big business with the individuals telling their own stories. So they show these sort of broad statistics or big business's angle, and then they share those personal human stories. They let the people tell their own stories, and that's effective. Alternatively, we had The Great Culling, Our Water. This was a more aggressive style. They had more aggressive fonts, a color palette, and word choice, even from the title. There's a disclaimer at the beginning of this documentary stating that the title is not reflective of the people they interviewed and that it was only the word choice of the filmmakers themselves. And I think that is indicative of a real choice to use inflammatory language like that. In this particular documentary, they also have the narrator as a character in a more investigative style rather than just a narrator voiceover. It also has an accusatory tone throughout. They clearly set it up as a conspiracy they're trying to debunk, if you will. So it has a different tone throughout than the previous documentary mentioned. They also utilize several persuasive strategies. The logos they utilized were startling statistics, experts from several relevant fields who even cited their own credentials. They also used scientific or scientific sounding arguments throughout. That was probably the most heavily used persuasive strategy in this piece. They also utilized pathos with the ill workers in the field and trying to engender outrage at this conspiracy for the public water system in the United States. They also utilized ethos with loaded language like toxic waste, somebody or business versus the public, that us versus them sort of mentality is also ethical. They were also able to create a sense of urgency. Sykes, Malik, and West discussed this again, as I previously mentioned, but they were able to do it in a little different way than the other documentary. They were able to point to this as something that Americans need to be aware of, that we need to rise up against the man who's telling us what to think and what to believe. They also had a deadline concept with poisoning our water. If we don't do something now, we're creating disease and brain problems and things like that. There is that deadline concept as well. They did intermingle types of persuasion throughout, as did the former, and they created the enemy or villain. They're not clear about who it is. At times they seem to allude to the fact it's our own government. Other times there must be someone behind this conspiracy. They also make it personal and inescapable that we are all suffering from this toxicity to our water. I think their use of inflammatory language seems to point to a personal agenda, which also connects to the agenda-setting theory. When a narrator or the person designing the message has an agenda, they're framing it, they're eliminating information that doesn't match what they want the receiver to take away from their message. And I think the inflammatory language makes it seem like there is an agenda, whether there is or isn't, and that's unfortunate. It also seemed to be critical of the viewer, which I thought was a little odd. They seem to make the viewer into a sheep that's just listening to whatever the government is feeding us, that we're ignorant or in some way not caring to know the truth. Sykes, Malik, and West suggest that it's far more effective to find common ground with the viewer of the message, and I think that would be an important step to make this piece more compelling. So in conclusion, this is a similar story with different approaches, but I would argue that A World Without Water seems more effective because it draws the viewer in and inspires compassion. And when that emotional connection is made, the viewer is far more likely to take action as opposed to just be startled or surprised or informed. If we want someone to take action, we need to appeal to their emotion. And this is a reference page for your information. I look forward to your comments.